Hello, I am Zelaros, and this is my retrospective review of Dark Souls 1, or more specifically, the remastered version. In this video, I intend to not only speak about my experiences playing through the game, but also actively compare aspects of the game to Dark Souls 3. I hope to give an interesting and unique perspective as somebody who played the series backwards. Many criticize the other titles of the franchise with Dark Souls 1 as a reference. I do want to address many of these criticisms, but also want to preface my video by saying that my aim isn't to definitively say which is better. I simply wish to create discussion on the topic. Dark Souls 1 holds a very special place in many people's hearts, as it has provided many extraordinary memories to look back on. While Demon Souls was technically the first of the Souls series, Dark Souls 1 seems to be held in the highest regard. I also adore the franchise and appreciate the design philosophy behind the games. Most games these days come with a difficulty setting that lets you play however you want. Usually this only changes number values on stuff like health and damage, and has little impact on the mechanics of the game. But From Software had a vision, and decided to make the games they wanted to. Their games, more often than not, are extremely rewarding to play. The sense of accomplishment that comes from defeating a challenging section or boss fight in the game doesn't compare to anything else I've ever played. With that being said, let us start this review off simple, with the story elements of the game. As you'd expect, going into Dark Souls 1 for the first time filled in a lot of the gaps that were missing for me from playing 3. It's a weird experience, that's for sure, but kind of neat at the same time. Learning about the origins of stuff I've seen is exciting in its own right. The game starts off with a cutscene that explains how the world was set up. Originally, there was a world ruled by dragons, but very powerful souls were found. Those that found the souls fought back against the dragons and created a new age, the Age of Fire. It's very similar to 3, as it introduces us to many key characters you'll find throughout the game. However, it does certainly feel a bit grander knowing that these characters were the ones who started it all. Aldrich and Yorm can be cool, but prior to fighting them, all I did was watch them stand up from the grave. With this introduction in 1, these key characters are responsible for creating the world that I will traverse through. It definitely makes their eventual encounters feel a bit more important. We eventually find that we are given the same task as 3, Link the Flame. It does explain a bit more as to why we are doing it, which wasn't really in 3, so again, it's a bit interesting for me. Essentially, the fire was fading, and Lord Gwyn sacrificed himself to prevent that from happening, and therefore prolong his Age of Fire. So we must set out on this journey across the kingdom of Lordran to do just that. The details of the story are kept vague, just like the other games in the series, but this is of course what started it all. As always, I recommend looking into the lore as it's very interesting. Now a story of course has characters, which I did not really mention in my video on 3. Many of the characters from 1 are actually in 3, although most are altered slightly. Now these characters can add a lot to the overall experience of the game, but I didn't really mention them because they aren't required. You don't really need to speak to most of the NPCs throughout both 1 and 3, so I intentionally didn't speak about them in my previous video. But I wanted to mention them here briefly because I've heard it's a bit lazy to recycle characters like this from game to game. I disagree with this and actually find it a bit cool to see old characters again. The reason is because they aren't reusing the same story arcs. Everybody has a new purpose in 3. It can be a bit nice to see a familiar face amidst the chaos. And again, it's neat for me to see the origins of these characters that I met in 3. That being said, after playing through both games, I've got to say the characters add an interesting sense of immersion to their worlds, and in different ways for each game. In 1, characters are kind of off, doing their own thing. All of the characters you meet, from the Crestfallen Warrior to Solaire, are just doing what they want to do. However, in 3, there is much more of an immediate goal in mind. Linking the Fire is a very pressing matter, and almost all the characters you meet in Lothric have something to do with that end goal. I don't see either method as being better or worse, but simply an interesting part of the series. I suppose this, in many ways, has to do with how the world is built. One of the biggest aspects of 1 that many people adore is its world design. Lordran is very open and interconnected from the start. Lothric is more rigid in its design. This is what people refer to as linearity and non-linearity. This leads to a major piece of criticism I'd like to address about this world design. Many people refer to Lordran as being superior in design due to its more open-ended structure and interconnectivity. I have to admit, I find this to be an amazing addition as well, and the designers did a fantastic job. Traversing through the Undead Burg to take an elevator to find yourself back at Firelink Shrine, your starting point, is just really cool. You really do feel like every area is connected to one another. But the linearity aspect of things is a completely different story. Essentially, the interconnectivity of the zones allows you to explore Lordran in a variety of different ways. Firelink Shrine is your start, and you can access multiple different areas from just this spot. You can reach Undead Burg, the Catacombs, New Londo Ruins, Valley of Drakes, and Blighttown, all from this one spot. That's pretty crazy, if you have already played the game. That's where I have a bit of contention. Let me explain further. Regardless of whether you've played another Souls games before, if you are a new player, you most certainly do not have that many choices on places to go. So let's break down the choices we do have as a newer player. If somebody is very explorative, we can go downward and access New Londo Ruins. This area is filled with ghost enemies that cannot be damaged unless you're cursed. This is immediately going to show a new player to turn around and that they aren't ready for this area. Already, the game is pushing the player away from these areas intended for higher levels. Now, if you happen to have the Master Key as a starting item, you can keep going and access the back door of Blighttown. But again, I don't expect a new player to know any of this. What else can be explored? Well, we can turn to our left out of Firelink Shrine and go towards the Catacombs. Now, before even getting to the Catacombs, a new player is going to get swarmed by skeletons and most likely get killed. Another way of showing the player that they aren't ready for this area. Or they can travel to the Undead Burg, with incredibly weak enemies that are intentionally designed to teach new players about what to expect in their travels. Now we have several options that actively try to tell a player to turn around, and one that is meant specifically for them. Doesn't seem that open-ended at that rate. A new player needs to start with the Undead Burg, and makes a very linear path forward. After ringing the first bell, one would need to travel through the lower Undead Burg, then to the Depths, to Blighttown, to Sen's Fortress, and to Anor Londo. After Anor Londo, it opens up a little bit, but until then, the game is essentially a straight path forward. A more experienced player, or somebody on a second playthrough, can traverse these areas easier as they've already learned from their experience. So the additional options for traveling through the world is a reward, in a sense, for already beating the content. But I don't really consider the entire game to be open-ended if it requires outright beating the game first. This is where I feel an illusion is created, an illusion of choice. It seems like you have a choice of where to go, but you're really pushed into a single path instead. Once you acquire the Lord Vessel, things open up a bit, and you get some choice as to where you'd like to go. You can choose to collect the Lord Souls in any order you'd like, but you must acquire all of them. I of course can't say this is linear, but despite the choice involved, I don't consider it non-linear either. All 4 Lord Souls are required to progress, so it ends up feeling more like a to-do list than anything else. You have to check off these souls in order to fight the final boss. You're still forced to do these things in order to actually progress through the game. But this isn't a bad thing. I feel like the term linear gets a bad rap. It's a good thing to have an objective and see where you're meant to go. Dark Souls 3 linearity is much more clear. You aren't given the option to mistakenly travel into an area like, I don't know, the Tomb of Giants, and get your ass kicked over and over and having no idea how to progress. This actually did happen to me the first time I ever played the game. In 3, you progress through each area in a set order, and the difficulty of those areas can be designed with this in mind. Speaking of the difficulty of areas, that's where Estus flasks have a huge impact. Both 1 and 3 have Estus, but they are designed very differently. In 1, you have a base of 5 flasks that can be upgraded to give you 10 by burning Humanity. Humanity is basically Embers from 3, except it doesn't give you a bonus to health. This maximum can be increased to 20 by acquiring the Rite of Kindling from the Catacomb. In 3, you have a set amount of flasks that can be increased by finding Estus shards out in the world to a maximum of 15. Now they represent the same thing, your mistakes. However, they are executed completely differently, and I actually prefer how 3 handles it. If you manage to get the Rite of Kindling early, it has a huge impact on the difficulty of many areas and bosses. Having 20 available Estus allows you to be a bit reckless without much of a downside. This isn't necessarily a problem on your first run through of the game, as newer players won't be exploring the catacombs until later on. However, as this was my second time playing through 1, it certainly has an impact for me. I feel this kind of adds a bit of an awkward position for balancing the game. Most areas and bosses can't be designed with the assumption a player will have 20 flasks, since as I mentioned, newer players likely won't. But then for a player like me, those areas become significantly less challenging. Areas like Sen's Fortress and Anor Londo aren't as threatening when I have 20 flasks that just burn through on their supposedly tougher environments. This doesn't exist in 3, as the only way to get more flasks is to find the shards, and to find the shards, you must progress. I prefer this because it lets the designers tune the difficulty of enemies around a knowledge of exactly how many flasks you would possibly have. Additionally, this actually lends to 3's world design. The world of 1, as I mentioned, is mostly a giant path that you can traverse. But the world of 3 is a series of circular zones. You are intended to explore and gather loot and still end up where you need to go. Areas like Farron Keep or the Undead Settlement are perfect examples of this. They loop around in a circle, and no matter the path you take, you can end up in the right place, as the shards further encourage that exploration. Now, the design of Estus Flasks in 1 isn't bad or anything, but I certainly prefer 3 more, and that goes for a lot of topics I bring up in this video. I do not want anybody to think I'm saying that these things from Dark Souls 1 are bad unless I outright say so. Rather, I simply mean to appreciate the improvements made over time. It is certainly interesting to look back and see where it all began, and appreciate the roots of the design philosophies, while also noting how it was improved upon and could potentially be improved upon further. Moving back on topic, Estus Flasks are generated by resting at the bonfire. However, bonfires are significantly more important and provide much more utility in 1. I know this is heavily preferred by many people compared to having a hub destination. Personally, I am a bit indifferent on the topic. I find it nice to have a hub destination to go to, but I don't really care as long as I'm able to do the same things at a bonfire, which you kind of are. The bonfire system of 1 certainly makes it feel like everything is being performed on the go. This is a grand journey after all, and it helps my immersion a little bit. There are 2 main aspects of bonfires that cause a lot of discussion and criticism: placement and fast travel. Bonfire placement is arguably very essential to the overall experience of 1. Often people will cite the fear and excitement of what's around the corner, if it could possibly be an extremely tough enemy, or the next bonfire. The space between the bonfires seems very calculated, and definitely adds to the experience. In 3, it is undeniable there is an abundance of bonfire. There are many extra bonfires that simply didn't need to be there, like one of the 3 between Vort and the Undead Settlement, or Wolnir in the Boreal Valley. Dark Souls 1 definitely makes better use of its bonfire placement, but I do feel it has a lot to do with the overall design of the world. As I mentioned, you are intended to thoroughly explore the areas, and not really need to backtrack in 3. Meanwhile, there's a lot of backtracking in 1. This comes down to the fast travel system. In 1, you're able to fast travel to a select amount of bonfires only after acquiring the Lord Vessel. In 3, it's active from the start. Now, I understand the idea that it can make it feel like a real world that you must traverse through, but I don't care much for the insane amount of backtracking. Once I clear an area and defeat a boss, I should be finished with that area. Defeat the gargoyles, time to run back down the tower. Defeat Sif, time to run back through the entire forest. If you need to go to the blacksmith to repair or upgrade an item, you need to run all the way back to him, even if you are deep into the depths or Blighttown. Then run all the way back to continue with your journey. It's a bit tedious in my opinion, and once I get fast travel, I feel so much more free. Of course, you can purchase items to essentially have a blacksmith in your bonfire, but you have to purchase it first for that to be effective, and it could just be baseline from the start. It would also add to the immersion a little bit too. Simple upkeep like repairing gear could be expected of you in this dangerous world. But in order to acquire and upgrade powerful weapons, you would need to see a professional. Oh, and also, I don't understand why it's limited in the number of bonfires you can travel to. You can warp from any bonfire, but only to a specific set of them. Seems a little odd to me. Essentially, I feel the fast travel system could have been a bit more lax, which is a sentiment I hold for a lot of different aspects in the game, like boss souls. When defeating boss enemies, most of them drop a powerful soul. These are consumables that grant a large amount of regular souls, or can be turned into powerful weapons. Which is something I'd love to play around with, as there are a ton of interesting weapons you can acquire. The problem is how unbelievably vague this system is. This is one of the times I'm going to say outright that something is done poorly. There is no way to tell what you will get from a soul, or even how to turn it into a weapon. I ended up having to look up online how to get it all to work. You should never have to look to a source outside the game to properly play the game. It works well with the story because of how disconnected it is from the gameplay. It isn't required to understand to progress and win. But these weapons can be very useful, and not having any idea how to get them could lock them off until a new game plus, if not outright prevent a person from getting them at all. The process of getting them is a bit awkward too, as you need to combine other weapons with soul to get the desired boss weapon. So without looking it up, you need to just piss away your resources in an effort to maybe get a weapon that you can use. Again, there is no way to tell even what you'll get from these souls. The system is poorly designed for sure. Now this is the part where you'd expect me to talk about how much better 3 did it compared to 1. However, I think it's important to note that this is one of those times where taking a look back retrospectively is a good idea. By looking back and understanding why something isn't good, can let designers look at that information going forward and improve upon them. As much as I think the system is poorly designed in 1, it is still a first game where they didn't have as much experience to look back on and help them in their design. So while we're on the topic of boss souls, what about the bosses themselves? Well, before I get into it, let's talk about the general combat of the game. Now in my previous video on Bloodborne, I noted how fast-paced the game was, and how many of the game's systems were designed around it. Well, Dark Souls 1 is essentially the complete opposite. It is incredibly slow. That's not a bad thing, but it is quite jarring coming from Bloodborne, that's for sure. It certainly has an adjustment period. This slower-paced gameplay is where the more methodical approach of the series comes from. Taking your time and waiting for the proper moment to strike is much more advantageous for you. Well, most of the time. As I mentioned in my video on 3, I feel Dark Souls implements a genius design of where it goes against traditional gameplay, and instead of enemies' attacks showing you when to dodge, it shows you where. However, I don't feel many of the enemies' designs really complement this design philosophy very well. To get an obvious example out of the way, the Silver and Black Knights. These knights seem intimidating and can do quite a bit of damage, until you realize that they're nothing but backstab fodder. It is unbelievably easy to get a backstab on these guys because of how telegraphed and slow their attacks are. This ends up making a fight with these guys feel more tedious than anything, with me just waiting for them to attack so I can just backstab them. But for a better example, let's look at Sif. Now Sif is the wolf to the knight Artorias and guards his grave. Artorias and Sif battled the Abyss together in the past until the knight failed his mission and fell to madness. This is where we see him in the DLC, which leads to an amazing boss fight that I will discuss later on. Anyway, if you decide to do the DLC prior to beating Sif, it can trigger an alternative cutscene in your main game where Sif even recognizes you. It can be a heartfelt moment when he sees you, but still takes up arms anyway. Sif is guarding the grave so that nobody will fall to the Abyss like his master. Despite knowing you, he will still honor his duty, just like you must honor yours. Neither of you really want to take place in this fight, but still have to. It's a really nice piece of story behind the fight, and is only amplified when we look into Artorias. It's a shame the fight is terrible. I know, that's going to be a very controversial statement right there, but I really noticed this problem with the combat when I was fighting Sif. Basically, the fight consists of Sif jumping around and you poking him in the feet until he eventually just dies. And I'm not really exaggerating either. The only time I took damage on this fight was because of my own impatience. Seriously, Sif is not threatening at all. All of his slashes and swings are easily just blocked, so just slap on a shield and you're good to go. Then you walk directly into his legs where he cannot physically hit you, and bam, there's a few strikes for you. My fight consisted of me continuously walking into his legs, hitting him, and then him jumping away. The complete opposite of an exhilarating fight. In fact, I was afraid I was going to bug him out several times. He ended up hopping around a bit too much, and I caught him in a seemingly endless loop of turning around. Only way it seemed to break was when I rushed under his legs to cause another jump away. The fight becomes a massive drag, and it's a real shame because of how interesting his backstory is. There are a lot of bosses like this, like the Bed of Chaos. I cannot talk about Dark Souls 1 and not mention this boss. Or an attempt at a boss. It is pretty well known how terrible this encounter is. It is easily the worst fight in probably any game I have ever played. And I have no idea how something like this was allowed past development. The entire fight is poking a tree on both sides and then hitting a dumb firebug in the middle of it while the entire room breaks apart. Platforming is not a strong element of the Souls series. The tree constantly tries to smack you off the platforms while firearms smack you from above. This isn't a boss fight. It really just becomes running back from the bonfire over and over until you get the lucky attempt where you can just finally be done with it. But then, there's the area and the lore of the boss that is so damn interesting. The Witch of Izalith was one of the 4 lords in the opening cutscene. She tried to extend the Age of Fire herself and failed miserably. Her failure created demonkind, and the Bed of Chaos continues to create more to this day. You are fighting the demented tree husk thing of the Witch of Izalith, which is super cool in concept. The area around the boss is also really awesome. It looks like a castle or fortress of some sort that is almost sunken into the magma. These ruins of Izalith demonstrate beautifully the destruction caused by the witch in her attempt to extend the Age of Fire. Something I really find interesting is some of the demons are just the Taurus and Capra demons, 2 bosses you fight earlier in the game. Normally this could come across as lazy, but where you fight them is above ground, far from Izalith. This is their home, more or less, the place of their creation. It makes complete sense for there to be a lot more of them around. It also makes sense the ones above would be more boss-like encounters to a brand new adventurer, who has never encountered these demons before. So much detail can be picked up from this area, and it's a shame that the boss is such a travesty. That isn't all there is to talk about, though. I feel the need to talk about a strange design oversight in regards to the Iron Golem and the Moonlit Butterfly. Both of these encounters don't necessarily have anything wrong with them on their own. In fact, I think the Butterfly has interesting mechanics when using a melee build. However, both of these bosses are turned into non-fights when using their available summons. You can summon NPCs to help you, but the issue is that they can just solo the boss with ease. I'm not even kidding. The summon on the Moonlit Butterfly absolutely destroys the boss. It's a complete joke. I know some people might say it's a very easy thing to just not use the summons, but I don't feel that argument really holds up. Sure, you don't need to use it, but the option is still available. If you feel like making things more difficult for yourself, then there isn't anything stopping you. But outside of a personal challenge, it doesn't make much sense to not use the most efficient tactics to win. When judging this kind of mechanic, we can't assume somebody will not use it, and it certainly has a massive impact on the encounter. So basically, these 2 bosses become irrelevant, which is pretty sad. Then of course we have the Asylum Demon, Stray Demon, and Demon Fire Sage, which are literally just reskins of each other. Now in the case of the Taurus and Capra demons, I find their reuse in Izalith to be thematically relevant, since as I explained, we are in their domain at this point. However, I cannot find any relevant reason as to why they're essentially the same boss 3 times. At least the Taurus and Capra demons become regular mobs. The Asylum demon is a fine tutorial boss, nothing really wrong there. The Stray demon is literally the same exact boss, except there are a few explosions added in. And it's directly beneath where you fight the tutorial boss. Not that exciting. Then the Fire Sage is the same exact boss yet again, but red this time. Wow. There are 26 total bosses in the entire game, including DLC, and 3 of them are repeats. Now that's lazy. We also have the Ceaseless Discharge. Now, what the hell happened here? You start the fight by picking up a set of armor. Then you can run away all the way to the door and he falls off the cliff? What? The fuck just happened? Is that actually considered a boss? Well, okay then. I am very disappointed by many of the boss encounters throughout the game. Of course, 3 and Bloodborne have their own problem bosses, but I find their bosses overall to be way more enjoyable. But they aren't all bad, of course. There are some enjoyable encounters. The Ornstein and Smo encounter is one of the more famous fights for their synergetic attack patterns, followed up by a surprise second phase. Gwyn is a fan-favorite boss with easily the greatest soundtrack in the entire game. Really quick side note, the soundtrack is absolutely amazing, even for the bosses I don't particularly care for. It greatly contributes to the atmosphere of the boss encounter. Anyway, I think my favorite boss fight in the entire game is of course Artorias in the DLC. He is absolutely exhilarating encounter. Despite having a broken arm, he is extremely agile, performing backflips and giant slam attacks. Artorias is, I feel, a perfect expression of Dark Souls combat mechanics. You need to skillfully manage your resources or else Artorias will harshly punish you. The encounter feels like an intense sword fight from start to finish. I know some people dislike the more traditional sword fight encounters, but I actually prefer them. When I fight something like the Gaping Dragon or Sif, I feel like I'm just smacking their leg a bunch until they die. But with fights like Artorias, I feel like I'm directly countering their swordsmanship with my own. I cannot praise this fight enough. There is something I definitely need to mention when it comes to enemy and combat design, and that is the bow. Now I spoke about a lot of the different bosses, but there are plenty of mini-bosses or just generally tough enemies throughout the world. These enemies don't respawn after dying, unlike most normal enemies. They are supposed to represent a challenge, but also great rewards. However, the bow is the most broken item in the entire fucking game. It single-handedly destroys the challenge of the world and has a massive impact on immersion. I've never seen anybody really talk about this either. It makes me wonder if people simply haven't experimented with the bow in this way, or people simply opt out of using it. So how is the bow so overpowered? Well, by itself, it isn't. What makes the bow so powerful is the arrows, or rather, the sheer volume that you can carry at once. You can equip 2 different arrow types, and carry 999 of each type. So essentially, you can equip 2,000 arrows at once. This allows you to casually poke down even the toughest of enemies with ease from a nice, safe distance. Many tough enemies like the Lake Hydras or the Undead Dragons are nothing more than a time sink with the bow. You have absolutely no danger due to the nature of enemy AI. Despite being pelted with arrows, many enemies will just not care unless you are within a certain range. This becomes even easier after getting the Hawk Ring in Anor Londo, increasing the range of your arrows. Since you have thousands of arrows, even the toughest of enemies are simply just a matter of time until they die, and you get all the loot. This is another part where I can see somebody saying to simply just not use the bow, just like it's easy to not use NPC summons. But again, regardless of your choice not to use something, doesn't remove the option to use it altogether. technically, the most efficient way of defeating these enemies is to use the bow. It really devalues the overall experience running through these areas. This extremely massive and intimidating Hydra, this giant lightning-shooting demon, or a massive rotting dragon? All of them are actually worthless because you have a bow. This is only achievable because of the sheer amount of arrows that you can carry at once. This is fortunately changed in future games where the amount of arrows is drastically reduced, but the bow has a massive overall impact on my enjoyment of the game. But, at least while you're sitting there for 10 minutes shooting volleys of arrows into what equates to a bullet sponge in other games, you can admire the gorgeous vision. I gotta say, From Software's art department always comes through and delivers absolutely beautiful scenery and worlds. I spoke a bit about Izalith already, but essentially Lordran in its entirety is a sight to behold. One of my favorite places in the game is Anor Londo, but not the normal version, the night version. I didn't know this on my first time playing through the game, but I found out that Gwynevere and almost all of the enemies in Anor Londo are actually illusions created by Gwendolyn. By attacking Gwynevere, all of the illusions break, and it suddenly becomes nighttime. The city that was once lit up and full of life becomes a ghost town in seconds. I find it has a creepy atmosphere to it, and I love it for that. I also really like Oolacile in the DLC. We need to traverse the city, which isn't really anything spectacular by itself. We've traversed the Undead Burg and New Londo ruins, so this isn't a unique experience. But what I enjoy about Oolacile is the fact that it takes place in the past. While things are certainly going to shit when we arrive, it gives us a glimpse into what life could have looked like before the main game had actually started. You can see the corruption taking over the city, but unlike something like New Londo ruins, it isn't something that has been sitting like that for a while. It's all happening right then and there. I often find a little bit of lore behind areas makes them much more enjoyable to traverse. Dark Souls 1 is an experience like no other. It is where many people started playing the series and can look back fondly with wonderful memories. I can certainly see the appeal. I understand why the Souls series is as popular as it is after playing through it myself. While I highly recommend experiencing it for yourself, Dark Souls 1 is far from perfect. I really do think nostalgia plays a huge role in the game's reputation, because looking back, I feel it hasn't aged well. There are a ton of things to like about this game, from the beautiful scenery and outstanding soundtracks to the interconnected world. But at the same time, there are quite a lot of speed bumps on your journey. The incredible slow combat, slogging back through the areas you've already beat over and over, the incredibly overpowered bow, and extremely disappointing boss fights. That's actually the best way to describe my experience. Disappointing. Perhaps Dark Souls 1 was overhyped for me. Perhaps that nostalgia people feel led to exaggerated descriptions and left me expecting way too much. Dark Souls 1 did, however, really make me appreciate the many improvements made over time. Despite my disappointment in the game itself, it managed to increase my enjoyment of the series' future titles, and thus, the series as a whole. For that, I must appreciate my time with the game. But, I do not think I will be returning to play this one anytime soon. Well, that's it for this video. I hope I was able to give a new perspective, or at least give topics for discussion. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.